Croft Farm. It all began 100 years ago, but the Gillett story actually begins a few years before that. From a Quaker family, Edward Gillett was the son of Charles Gillett, a leading light in the Gillett Bank based in Banbury, Oxfordshire. Edward was the 9th of 11 children, and after completing his education at a friend's school in Scarborough, he entered the family bank in Banbury. But at 20 years old, he decided to leave the bank and travelled to Canada for a year. He then came with his sister to Suffolk in 1904, farming at Walpole. But it's 1916 when he marries Edith Arnold of Leiston, where the story of Croft Farm really begins. He moved to what is now Croft Farm at Snape, which was purchased at auction in July of that year. Initially, the farm was called Commons Farm, with much of the land being rough grass for grazing cattle on fields with names such as Broom Hill and Wood Common. In 1917, Arnold was born, and in 1920 his sister Daphne. Arnold also went on to a friend's school at Saffron Walden and then on to Oakland's Agricultural and Horticultural College in St Albans, before returning to Snape Croft, as the farm was then called. Improvements to land and buildings took place over the next 2 decades. Suffolk punches were the main source of power for carting and cultivations, cattle and pigs were kept, and roots and barley were grown as animal feed. Binders and threshing machines, tumbrels and smythe drills were a common sound on the farm back then. Edward improved the farmhouse by building 2 bays on the front in the early 1930s, but the Gillett's hard work on the farm was soon interrupted.
This was our power on a scale to dwarf even the grandeur of Nazi dreams.
Arnold was 22 years old when war broke out, but as a member of a Quaker family, stayed on the farm as a conscientious objector. This may not have been seen as the right thing to do in many people's eyes, and was no doubt a very difficult time for Arnold. However, hard work was the order of the day, and food production became an increasingly important job, both during and after the war, when as much land as possible was brought into production. A round delivering vegetables to Thorpeness and the surrounding area was established, using an Alvis motor with a trailer towed behind. German prisoners who had digs at Greenhay's house next door actually worked on the farm during this time too. Through the Arnold family, who farmed at Aldhurst Farm in Leiston, Arnold met Elizabeth, and they married in 1953. Arnold's great interest was growing more vegetable crops and even flowers, which he sold directly from the farm gate, and with the vegetable round based mainly around Thorpeness and Aldborough. Arnold and Elizabeth started married life in Wad cottages, before moving in 1955 into the farmhouse, when Arnold's mother and father moved across the road into what is now Holver House. Their family, Mary, Edward and John, all grew up on the farm. The next big change on the farm was when nuclear power arrived at Sizewell. Croft Farm was blessed with 8 and a bit pylons, which marched straight through the farm on the longest route they could possibly find. The introduction of an irrigation system in 1966 allowed potatoes to be an important crop alongside the vegetables. Potato harvesting was a big job, which took up much of the autumn, and it was all hands to the pump, picking potatoes from the clods and stones as they came up on an early mechanised harvester. This harvester actually produced many archaeological finds, as most of the soil in the field was lifted. 1 or 2 notable finds, such as a Bronze Age pot and a flint axe head, remain in Ipswich Museum to this day. Edward came back to work on the farm in 1976, after spending 3 years at Writtle Agricultural College in Essex.
The heat wave of '76 was beginning to cause real hardship, not least for farmers. They had to give livestock winter feed because all the grass had dried out. Forecasters said there hadn't been a summer like it this century.
The 2 years of 1975 and 1976 were remarkable, particularly in the east of England, for 2 consecutive years because of drought. This meant Edward and his Writtle pals spent much time at Chelmsford Open Air Swimming Pool. However, on the farm, the irrigation system installed 10 years previously was about to pay dividends. The potato crop in particular benefited, with prices reaching record highs and local fish and chip merchants on their knees begging for supplies. The halcyon days of growing vegetables on a small scale with hand labour was gradually coming to an end, with more mechanised systems on larger fields making it very difficult to make worthwhile sales of any quantity. Virtually every shed on the farm was full of laying hens at this time, and rats which used to feed on the layers' mash and any profits which might have been had. Edward came back with fresh ideas and gradually moved towards more productive fieldscape crops, as well as reintroducing cattle for grazing and fattening. Sugar beet has been an important crop for the farm since the 1950s right through to the present day. Snape in itself was famous for a field in the village, located near the Crown Inn, that grew the first commercial crop of sugar beet, which was exported to Holland in 1909. The building of an anaerobic digestion plant close by at Rendlesham has in the last few years allowed crops of sugar beet and maize to be grown on the farm for energy production. Electricity produced is used to condition vegetable stores on the site. Through all of this time, from 1923 onwards, 3 farm workers were the mainstay of the farm: Willie Hudson, Dowie Bloomfield and Leslie Lewis. In addition, Dolly Stebbings worked in the house and spent many hours looking after Mary, Edward and John. The farm had its own in-house romance as Dolly and Leslie Lewis married in 1960. Willie received his 51 years service award in 1974 at the Suffolk Show, with both Dowie and Leslie following suit in the next few years. Edward met Sally and married in 1978, beginning married life in a small bungalow just over the road from the farm. Sarah and Robert were born in 1981 and 1984 respectively, before the family moved into the farmhouse in 1990, when Arnold and Elizabeth moved to Leiston.
Good afternoon. The worst storms for hundreds of years hit the south of England early this morning, killing a dozen people and bringing the whole southeast to a halt. They came without warning in the early hours of the morning, winds that hit 110 miles an hour and then went off the gauge. The storms have done millions of pounds worth of damage, blacked out cities and towns, blocked hundreds of roads, wiped out a whole region's train services, ships have capsized and run aground, buildings collapsed, and millions of people were prevented from getting to work.
In the early hours of the 16th of October, the wind steadily increased to a point which caused devastation on the farm and in the surrounding area. Numerous large, healthy oak and ash trees were blown out of the ground and buildings were extensively damaged. A dramatic event that will stay in memories forever. The farmhouse did take a battering in the 87 storm, but survived remarkably unscathed. However, it was given a makeover just prior to the new generation moving in, particularly the kitchen area, which still had a brick floor, coke-fired stove and a stone sink with whitewash on many of the walls. The seeds of diversification with tourism were sown in 1987, when a small 5-van caravan site was set up with the Camping and Caravanning Club. When legendary farm worker Leslie Lewis finally retired in the early 90s, a new era was to begin. The necessary trend towards larger-scale arable farming eventually led to a contract farming arrangement for the arable land with Kerr Farms, a local large-scale farm business. Sheep replaced cattle on the grassland for ease of handling, and Edward returned to college at the age of 40, if nothing else but to become computer literate. This led to some outside work with Otley College and farm administration with Kerr Farms. Meanwhile, Sally oversaw the construction of tourist accommodation, which was to be the main diversification project at Croft Farm. The granary was the first of the farm's buildings to be converted in 2000, with the first guests arriving in 2001. And following the success of that conversion, the forge followed in 2002, being completed in 2003. With Aldeburgh only 10 minutes away and its central location close to the Suffolk Heritage Coast, Croft Farm is, after all, the ideal place to stay in self-catering accommodation or on the Caravan Club site. Most recently, Croft Farm hosted its own wedding in 2012, when Eddie and Sally's daughter Sarah married Wesley Matthews, who in 2016 welcomed baby Olive into the world. For 100 years, Croft Farm has been home to the Gillett family. And as for the next 100, well, the story continues.